Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls all alike.
Have you ever sat there and wondered to yourself,
Exactly what's the presidency of George Washington like?
there, go ahead and quit talking to yourself. One, because it's weird, and two, because today I'm rolling through history, we're going to learn all about the very first presidency of the United States, George Washington. Now, I know that we all know George Washington was the first president of this amazing nation. Heck, maybe you know some of his more famous exploits as a general during the Revolution.
I mean, heck, maybe you don't know a single thing about the guy, and that's why you clicked on the video today. Who knows?
Anyway, today I'm rolling through history. We're going to look at George Washington, and well, this isn't going to be your typical biography video. That is, our focus isn't going to be on his background, upbringing, his generalship, or anything like that.
Today's video, we're going to focus on his presidency specifically. What bills did he sign? What happened during his tenure? What famous things happened that helped shape the place of the presidency today?
So George Washington had the pleasure of becoming America's very first president. Now, just a year prior to his inauguration in 1789, the Continental Congress had just brought in the U.S. Constitution as the ultimate authority in the land. Essentially, it's the framework in which the government is to be ran. And the Constitution calls for an elected president to be the head of the government. And, to literally no one's surprise, the populace unanimously voted in the general who just secured liberty for the now infant nation, George Washington. President Washington served for his first term, 1789 through 1792, and ultimately, his first term can be defined as, well, determining what exactly the presidency is and does.
Remember, he's the first person to ever do the job.
Not to mention, we literally just got done fighting a huge, not to mention an expensive war over one person having too much power. One of his first actions as a president is to define what exactly is a congressional power and where exactly is the line where it's a presidential power versus a congressional power, and vice versa. Now, the Constitution calls for a Supreme Court for the entire land. However, it doesn't give a specific number of judges. So Washington, well, he decides on 10 judges. Now, later on in American history, Congress is going to decide to cap the amount of judges at 9, as to give an uneven amount of votes during the decision. Washington, well, by electing 10, he set the precedent that there should be close to that amount. And that's up to the president to get to pick and choose them.
Another thing that President Washington's first term is defined as is design the presidential cabinet.
Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, Kyle, why is that a big deal? Presidents have cabinets all the time.
Well, remember, the Constitution only requires a president and not a cabinet of political advisors.
And the idea of unelected members of the government being allowed to run things, influence politicians, can you say scandalous?
Washington, however, realizing his inability to keep tabs on multiple areas of the government at all times, chooses 4 men to join him in his political cabinet.
These 4 men are Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Attorney General Edmund Randolph, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and the Secretary of War, Mr. Henry Knox. Together, these 4 men became President Washington's advisors for literally everything. Need to use the army for something? Well, better get Henry Knox's advice. Can the president actually do this, or is that Congress's job? Well, let's go ahead and ask Mr. Randolph.
And this is where we get the 2 ways to commonly interpret the Constitution. You see, Congress, when debating whether or not a specific phenomenon or modern problem falls under the power of either the president, the federal government, or the state specifically,
choose to interpret the Constitution in regards to that issue as either loosely or strictly. That is, can the president enact a census or tax on whiskey like President Washington did in 1791? Well, the Constitution is pretty loose as far as the president having the power to do things like enacting a census. So that's what he did. A tax on whiskey, though? Hold up! That's a congressional issue, because taxes must be voted on by Congress, and that tax actually led to the now infamous Whiskey Rebellion, which determined the president to be the commander-in-chief of the United States military. Another important factor of President Washington's first term is that he oversaw several big things take place that since define what presidential power consists of.
For instance, during his first term as president, battles with the Native Americans were a common issue. You see, America, as far as the land goes, only consisted of the original 13 colonies. Past that border, well, native lands. And many citizens would often cross the border to either hunt game, trap, or even start farms, often called settlers.
And these settlers, well, they would often clash with the native tribes to the degree of wars.
During his first term as president, George Washington sought the natives be declared a separate nation and thus, well, he doesn't have to follow the Constitution when dealing with non-citizens. The last thing that we're going to touch on for his first term is the bringing in of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, aka the Bill of Rights. So basically, in a ultra summed-down version of post-war politics, there were essentially 2 political camps that one could find themselves in for political thought. Point of view is the Federalist view. Federalists were your guys who wanted a strong government, aka a governor, mayor, Congress, president, and so forth. And all these guys had the power to enact taxes, rules, regulations. For an example, the area of Tennessee would be under control of representatives in Philadelphia, who never set foot in Tennessee once. And then you had the anti-federalist view. These guys didn't want a strong centralized government. You live in Alabama? Cool. Let your local mayor figure things out for you. Now the student in Philadelphia who has never stepped foot in Alabama. And the 2 thoughts? Well, they dominated everything. According to the Constitution now. Well, the federal government held ultimate authority. So duels and rebellions began breaking out over which side was better. The politicians on both sides voted in the Bill of Rights as a compromise. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here about the Bill of Rights. However, I did make a video regarding the Bill of Rights previously, so I'd highly recommend you watch it. So there you have it, folks. President Washington's first term. Ultimately, it was the guinea pig term to figure out how exactly do we do this thing. Next up,
Term 2. So it's 1793, and President Washington is again elected, unanimously, mind you, for a second term. Now, if his first term is referred to as defining the role of the presidency, second term, well, I guess you can argue that it was the birth of American politics as we have come to define it as of today. So remember when we touched on political argument? There was the whole Federalist versus anti-Federalist. Well, shocker, by second term, that argument had integrated into open duels and fistfights, both in the halls of Congress and taverns alike. So much so that the populace began to form societies or political groups based on their shared job experience. For instance, lawyers, doctors, etc. formed democratic societies and clubs where they would then fund their ideal candidates, while artisans, workers, farmers, etc. often formed Republican associated clubs and thus fund their preferred candidates. And it got to the point that local governments would become controlled by the preferred party. President Washington, however, became a very outspoken opponent of political parties, starting that the experimental liberty would crumble under the hope of party achievement. And these party politics would often lead into what became known as the Neutrality Act of 1793. In 1789, France and Britain went to war, and the problem was, well, France literally just won its independence, so many wanted to assist them. However, many also, well, they didn't. And Britain would offer escorts for American traders to travel through the Mediterranean unharmed by French or African arrests. But, well, vice versa, France would offer assistance for the same reasons. So in 1793, Washington signs two acts into law. One, the Neutrality Act, which essentially stated America as being neutral in their affairs. Two, the Naval Act. This act allowed Congress to create 4 Navy ships, all complete with guns and Marines. And these ships, well, they would potentially ward off the pirates and threats posed on American commerce. And they also had, with the full weight of the government behind them, the ability to defend themselves, whatever that may entail. President Washington also had the pleasure of being the first president to make laws surrounding slavery. Let's take a quick trip back to when Britain first formed the colonies. The economy of the colonies was based on farming output, specifically tobacco in the south and things like cattle, trapping, logging, etc. in the north. By far, tobacco was the most profitable economic trait in the colonies. Fast forward to post-revolution, in order for the Constitution to be implemented, all 13 states had to ratify it. The problem was that the northern states wanted to do away with slavery since 1, it wasn't a prevalent need in America as an economic tool, and 2, since the South disproportionately held more slaves than the North, they had a disadvantage in Congress due to more representation. By the time of Washington's second term, this power dynamic began to take shape, primarily due to the North beginning to industrialize its economic output, while the South, by large, remained a one-crop economy. Now, as a whole, your average American can have cared less regarding the issue, as the need for them didn't affect them directly. Economically, however, the need was pretty clear, and abolitionist thoughts were beginning to gain popularity in America at this time. So much so that Congress had passed legislation in 1794 that would outlaw it. Now, the southern states relied on it for their entire economy, so the South, surprise, surprise, threatened war if the bill was signed. So in 1794, Washington signed 2 compromises into law. The first was the Slave Trade Act of 1794. This act made it illegal for any American ship sailing as an officially sanctioned U.S. ship to participate in any transatlantic trade for slaves. If caught, they became deemed an illegal smuggler and thus treated as such. It did as well preserve slavery in the South, so long that all slaves remained in the South and that proper documentation of sales, owners, trades, who belongs to who. Basically, slave owners, sellers, all that had to keep records on their merchandise. The other act that Washington signed into law was the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, shocker, some slaves didn't like being slaves. Who would have guessed? So they would escape from time to time in hopes of making it up to the north and into freedom. The problem that slave owners would then face is trying to get them back. States were extremely independent back then, and even though two states may share similar laws towards slavery, what would often happen is if a black person was caught without papers of either free man or belonging to someone, they would either be jailed or shot. And well, owning a slave was expensive. We've all seen how people react over a dog getting shot. So if a slave owner had one run away, they would usually send a posse after them. And the idea of an armed group running around, potentially running into other posse groups, not to mention the abolitionist groups running around, well, I think you understand what would happen. So the Fugitive Slave Act essentially set up a pipeline for properly returning runaway slaves, providing compensation to plantations who lost slaves or who were then shot by an illegal posse. So the last thing we'll mention regarding Washington's second term is that he had the pleasure of bringing 5 states into the Union: North Carolina, Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Now, if you recall a little bit ago, we discussed the power balance in Congress. The amount of representatives the state has is based on its population, and if you look at the list of states I just gave you, 3 of those states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina, were prime land for tobacco and large-scale operations that require slave labor. So Congress offered resistance to Tennessee and Kentucky joining, since the power balance would disproportionately land in the South's favor. In fact, due to Tennessee being next to Mississippi, an area controlled by the French, Congress made Tennessee claim loyalties to America and disavow the French and the Spanish.